Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
I am going to start with the part everyone likes to skip because it is messy and not flattering, which is the moment I realized I had been raised on a family slogan that sounds nice on holiday cards, but collapses the second it costs anyone anything real. Because when my doctor sat me down and explained, in careful, calm sentences that made my stomach flip, that postponing the surgery again could turn a painful problem into a permanent limitation, I did what any normal person would do and called my parents, and I honestly believed they would say yes before I even finished the sentence, not because we are perfect, but because this is the kind of thing you assume parents exist for. The urgent and unglamorous moments when someone you love needs you to show up with more than a speech. I laid it out without drama, telling them my insurance would cover a chunk and I had savings for some of it, but I was still short, and I was not asking for a handout. I was asking for a bridge, something we could put in writing with a plan and a timeline. Because I am not irresponsible and I am not trying to make my problems their problems, but this was not a new phone or a vacation. It was my body and my future, and I said all of that in one breath because I thought clarity would make it easier for them to say yes. Yet my dad went quiet the way he does when he is about to turn a decision into a lecture, and my mom jumped in with that soft voice she uses when she wants to sound generous while saying no. And they started stacking words like sandbags, phrases about how the economy is tough and the market is unpredictable, and they are on a fixed plan right now, and they wish they could help, but timing is bad, and if timing were different they would do anything. Absolutely anything. Which is a sentence people love because it sounds heroic and costs nothing. I did not argue, because I grew up understanding that if you give them an exit ramp they will take it and call it wisdom, so I nodded and thanked them and said I understood, even though I did not. Because I know what their vacations cost, and I know what their kitchen remodel cost, and I know they like to pretend they are just keeping their heads above water while they shop for upgrades. But I swallowed it, and I told myself not to be dramatic. And I told myself that adults handle their own business, so I went home and opened a spreadsheet and started moving things around, canceling what could be canceled and calculating how many months I could keep working through the pain without making everything worse. And I did all of that to keep from thinking about the part where it felt like I had been weighed and measured and found not worth the inconvenience. Here is the part one kept to myself, because I knew if I said it out loud someone would accuse me of being manipulative, which is that before I hung up I asked my mom, very politely, to text me what she had just explained so I could keep my notes straight for the insurance coordinator, and she did, because she trusts that I will never use the truth against her, and the text was perfect in the way only a polite refusal can be. Full of wish we coulds and maybe next year's, and please keep us posted. And I saved it in a folder with my medical forms, not because I had a plan yet, but because something in me understood that people who are comfortable saying no to your pain will later try to rewrite history. And the only way to keep your sanity is to keep receipts. I should tell you I did not cry that night, not because I am brave, but because anger dried everything up, and I made a decision that felt small and also huge, which was that I was done auditioning for their compassion, and if they could not show up for basic health, they would not get front row seats to the parts of my life that require effort. So I wrote an email to my human resources person asking how to change my emergency contact and medical proxy, and I listed my friend Dana instead of my parents, and then I sent my parents a simple message thanking them for being honest and letting them know I was updating my forms so I would not accidentally burden them with late-night calls. And if you think that sounds petty, then you have never had to carry pain while the people who raised you prioritize appearances, and I can live with petty if it means I am no longer begging for the bare minimum. That should have been the end of the week, except it was not, because a cousin I do not even talk to much pinged me that weekend with a cheerful photo that did not compute at first. A mirror shot with my sister grinning and a stylist fussing with a dress that did not look off the rack, and a caption that said final fitting done and the location tag that made my jaw lock. And before I could tell myself a story about discounts or gifts or anything that would make this less ugly, my phone lit up again with a video from a different angle and a voice in the background saying Mom and Dad are going all out because you only do this once, which is when my hands stopped shaking and my head went very still. Because the story I had been fed about a tight budget and terrible timing was about to fall apart in a way even they would not be able to spin. The part that stings is not the dress or the city or the caption. It is the arithmetic that does itself in your head before you can stop it. Because once you know there is a designer fitting and international travel and a planner who answers to your sister like she is a pop star instead of a person getting married, you cannot unknow that the math your parents gave you about tight belts and careful choices was a performance, and once that performance cracks, all the old lines they used on me about fairness and balance and treating both daughters the same start sounding like a speech they deliver to themselves so they can sleep at night. And I am not saying weddings should be cheap or that love should be rationed. I am saying I asked for help with something that affects how I move through my life, and they told me timing was bad while they were wiring non-refundable deposits for a party. I did not call and scream because I have learned that anger is a gift to people who want to make the story about your tone. So instead I did what I always do when something feels slippery, which is to gather facts until the story cannot be bent. And that meant I pulled the estimate from my patient portal and I printed it. I pulled the text my mom sent and I printed it. And I sat there with two pieces of paper that by themselves are just documents, but together are a mirror. And then I started a new email thread with a clean subject line that was boring and undeniable, something like medical bill follow-up and family boundaries, and I wrote a message that was polite to the point of cruelty, thanking them for the phone call last week, restating that I had asked for a bridge loan to close the gap between what insurance covers and what I can pay, quoting my mom's text that said they wished they could help but could not, and asking them, for my records, to reply with a simple confirmation that they cannot contribute any amount toward a medically necessary surgery, even a small amount, even a structured plan, because the hospital had asked me to document my support network before approving a payment schedule. I know how that reads, but you should understand this was not a tantrum. It was a boundary written in permanent ink, because I have spent years letting conversations drift into fog and then being told later I misheard. So I copied my Aunt Linda and my Uncle Mark, not to humiliate anyone but because they were listed as backups on old forms and needed to know I would not be listing my parents anymore, and I kept the tone dry and adult and I hit send. And in that tiny motion I felt something in me. Stop waiting for permission, because once a truth is in writing you can stop arguing with the version of you they prefer, the one who is dramatic or sensitive or always making a big deal out of nothing. While I waited for the reply that I already knew would be defensive and circular, I made another choice that will sound petty to someone who has never had to prove that their pain is not a negotiation tactic, which is that I opened the app we all use for family money stuff, and I sent a request to my parents for the exact shortfall amount with the note surgery balance you said you cannot help with. And then I canceled it the second it went through so there would be no transfer, leaving behind only the notification and the words they would have to read, a tiny sting they could not ignore or dismiss as a misunderstanding, and before anyone calls that tacky. Let me tell you how many times I have been told to be grateful for lessons about responsibility delivered by people who outsource their own. The replies came in a rush, and they were exactly what you would expect. My mom writing that she felt blindsided and that copying relatives was unnecessary and hurtful. My dad insisting that I was framing things unfairly because weddings are one-time events, while medical bills can be paid over time, as if walking with pain should be scheduled around a calendar of photo opportunities. And both of them circling the same excuse about timing and budgets and plans made months ago, and if you think any of that softened me, then you have not lived on the receiving end of selective generosity, because all it did was make me calmer, and I wrote back once, short and clean, that I was not asking for debate, I was asking for confirmation. And that without support I would proceed alone and adjust my relationship with them accordingly. That should have been the moment when everything went quiet, but this family does not do quiet. It does spectacle, and within a day a cousin sent me a rehearsal dinner clip that felt like it had been produced for my benefit. My dad standing with a glass and a microphone and a grin I know too well, saying into a room full of people that nothing matters more than taking care of your children, and that is why they had spared no expense to give Chloe the wedding of her dreams, because you only get to do this once if you do it right. And I sat there with the volume low, watching his mouth form the words he had carefully avoided with me, and I realized the story I had put in writing was about to become a lot more public than anyone planned. Because once that kind of speech leaves a microphone, it does not belong to the speaker anymore. It belongs to whoever needs the truth to finally have a witness. When the video of my dad's toast made its little loop across family chats and group texts, I was still telling myself to be reasonable, to be measured, to keep my hands off the red button that sends a private wound blasting into the open. And the only way I knew to keep from blowing up the whole thing was to do the one thing nobody in my family is good at, which is to go quiet on purpose. So I stopped answering calls, I turned off read receipts, I let messages pile up until the screen looked like sirens, and I told my boss I would be working remote for a stretch, because I needed to get my head straight before the procedure and before the circus that seemed determined to shove itself into every corner of my day. And then I got to work on something that is not glamorous, not cinematic, not even satisfying in the moment, but absolutely essential if you have ever tried to argue with people who love revisionist history, which is documentation so clean it could pass an audit. I opened a folder on my desktop and labeled it with a neutral title so I would not feel like a villain every time I dragged something in, and then I started collecting without commentary, the medical estimate with the date stamped at the top, the text from my mom where she wrote that they could not contribute anything right now, the emails where I asked for confirmation and they gave me paragraphs about timing and intent without offering even a token plan, the rehearsal dinner clip with my dad's line about sparing no expense, and the screenshots from Venmo and Zelle where deposits to vendors slid out of their account like it was a faucet they never once pretended was broken. And I did it with the calm of someone who knows she might be accused of exaggerating later and wants the truth to be boring and undeniable when the time comes. I did not attend the wedding, which apparently shocked people who think you should show up to clap for a production that was financed with the budget that could have kept you from limping upstairs, and if you want to know whether that decision hurt, I will tell you it did. Because I am not made of stone and I am not immune to the strange gravity of a family event where everyone plays their designated part, but I also knew that showing up would be an alibi for them, a way for them to photograph me in the crowd and later claim that everything was fine and loving and mutually understood. So I chose the ache that comes from standing firm over the hangover that comes from betraying yourself, and I let their group photos roll past my eyes without clicking. And I made a promise to myself that I would not give them a single image they could paste over what they had done. Chloe called me twice and left messages that were a mix of pleading and scolding, the kind of tone she uses when she is halfway convinced she is being kind and halfway convinced she is the victim, telling me that I was ruining family harmony and that weddings are once in a lifetime while surgeries happen all the time, and that if I had just been more patient maybe our parents could have helped later, and I listened once and then I archived it. Because I am not taking moral lectures from someone who schedules her empathy around vendor availability, and before anyone says I am jealous, you should know that I have rooted for Chloe my whole life, even when rooting for her meant shrinking myself to fit whatever space was left. And I am done with that particular sport. Somewhere in the middle of my silence and their spectacle, a bridesmaid with more enthusiasm than discretion posted a behind-the-scenes reel that included a little offhand remark about a magazine submission. And I felt my back straighten because that detail opened a door I had not known existed, and if you think I leapt at it immediately, then you do not understand how sweet patience can taste when you have been pushed to the edge, because what I did was wait. And while I waited, I tightened every bolt. I sent a formal letter to my insurer asking for an expedited review based on worsening symptoms. I pushed my surgery to the earliest date my doctor would allow without risking recovery. And I updated my will and medical proxy so that if anything went wrong, nobody with the last name that failed me would be able to make a decision on my behalf. The revenge in this chapter is not flashy, but it changed everything inside me, because I took back control of the narrative they had always written for me, the one where I am the difficult daughter who makes things complicated. And I did it by making myself administratively untouchable, and then I did one extra thing that every person who has ever been gaslit should learn how to do, which is to create a quiet record that does not need an audience to be powerful. So I typed up a timeline in plain language with dates and quotes and attachments, and I shared it in a private drive with 3 people who love me without conditions, my friend Dana, my coworker Luis, and my neighbor Patrice, with a note that said, if anyone in my family tries to rewrite this, Here is the version that does not move, and I cannot tell you how much lighter my chest felt after I pressed share. The cliff edge arrived the following week when the magazine email finally landed in Chloe's inbox, and because she lives for applause and forgets who sees what, she forwarded it to our family thread with a string of exclamation points and a line about how our parents' generosity had made a feature possible, and I saw a pull quote from my dad about how their family believes in investing in what matters most. And it was so perfectly on brand that I actually laughed, because at that point the truth did not need my anger. It just needed a stage, and as I looked at that line and then at the folder of receipts I had built piece by piece in the dark, I realized the quiet phase was over and the move I had been shaping in my head was finally ready to breathe air. The magazine link landed in the family thread with the kind of excitement that usually belongs to newborn announcements or miracle promotions. A glossy spread with a headline about timeless celebration and a pull quote from my dad about how our family believes in investing in what matters most. And while every part of me wanted to throw the phone across the room and let someone else be the adult for once, I did the thing I had been building toward quietly and steadily, which was to let their own words do the heavy lifting while I provided nothing more than context. So I opened a blank post and wrote a simple line that started with "Thank you to everyone who asked why I was not at my sister's wedding." Then I added that a few weeks earlier I had asked our parents for a small, structured bridge so I could move forward with a medically necessary surgery, that I had been told the timing was impossible and the budget was tight and maybe next year, and that the same week deposits were being made to vendors for a celebration that was beautiful and expensive by design, and I attached exactly 2 images that did not need captions. My dad's quote about investing in what matters most right next to my hospital estimate with my identifying details blurred, but the bottom line clear as a bell, and I ended with a note that said, "This is not a request for money, and this is not a plea for sympathy. This is just an answer to the question you keep asking, and because I know how quickly a clean message can get twisted, I turned off comments and locked the privacy to the circle of people who already knew enough to triangulate the truth without my help. Before I hit publish, I did one more thing that people will debate, and I am fine with that, because I forwarded the magazine link and my 2 attachments to the editor, whose name was in the footer, with a short note that said, "I am not asking you to take anything down. But since you ran an inspirational quote about investing in what matters, I think it would be fair to know that the same people quoted declined to contribute even a token plan toward their other daughter's surgery, and if you are ever curious about the full picture beyond a pretty weekend, I have dates, documents, and a timeline." And then I pressed send and I put my phone face down and I went for a very slow walk around the block to keep myself from pacing a trench into my floor, because revenge that relies on the truth still rattles your bones. When I came back, the post had done what clear truth always does in families that rely on fog. It cut through every speech and every excuse, and it landed like a dull thud in the middle of the room. And within minutes my messages filled with a mixed bag that told me I had struck exactly the nerve I meant to, aunts writing that they were surprised and hurt and wishing I had kept it private, cousins quietly saying they had always felt the tilt but never had proof, old neighbors sending a quick line that said, "Proud of you for saying it out loud," and then my mom's voice notes stacked one after another with that trembling tone that used to make me cave, telling me I had humiliated them, that I had ruined a milestone, that I had misunderstood their financial situation, and that I should take it down before more people saw it, which is when I exhaled and realized I was not shaking, because I had not said a single thing that was not documented, and I had not used a single adjective they could argue with. I had only placed a quote about values next to a bill about reality and let the contrast make the point. Chloe called me crying, the kind of tears that sound like a performance even when they are real, saying she wished I had come to her privately, that she would have found a way to help, that I had turned her joy into a referendum on our parents. And I told her as evenly as I could that I had gone to the only people who could have made a decision in time, that she is not a bank and it is not her job to clean up messes our parents make, and that I was sorry her feature weekend had to share oxygen with a truth that existed whether I typed it or not. And then I did something that tasted like steel and relief at the same time. I ended the call without promising anything, without promising to fix, to soften, to erase. And I blocked the family thread for 24 hours so I would not be tempted to negotiate my own experience down to something palatable. Because I have learned that clarity is a habit, I sent a final email to my parents that was written like a memo to people who prefer minutes and agendas, restating that I would not be answering calls for a while, that my medical proxy and emergency contact had been updated, that any further communication should be in writing for the sake of accuracy, and that I wished them well with the attention the article would bring. And I added one sentence that felt like sliding a heavy door into place, which said that I do not accept retroactive gestures made to manage a public relations problem, and that if they chose to participate in the value they had quoted, they could do it by being honest with themselves first. And then I closed the laptop and let the silence do its work. The part that people do not tell you about a move like this is that it does not end with a single post. It ripples, because truth reshapes rooms by inches, and by late afternoon the ripples had turned into unexpected waves. A message from a family friend who sits on committees with my dad saying he might want to get in front of this before it becomes a topic at the next meeting. A polite inquiry from the magazine editor asking if I would be open to a brief call about source verification for a follow-up, and a voicemail from an unknown number that started with a hospital name and ended with a promise to discuss an update to my account status first thing in the morning. And if you think I slept that night, you are kidding yourself. Because I lay there with my heart doing little sprints and my brain doing tria, knowing that the next day would either be a cleanup of my own boundaries or the moment when the people who taught me about investments finally learned what returns actually look like. By the time the sun dragged itself to a place that most people would call late morning, which for me just meant I had made coffee I never drank and walked circles around the same few thoughts until they stopped feeling like a stampede, the 3 ripples from the day before had turned into doors I could either walk through boldly or pretend I did not see, and I decided that the version of me who keeps the peace at her own expense was officially retired, so I called the hospital first because health is not a prop in anyone's drama, and I reached a billing supervisor who, in a voice that sounded like competence rather than pity, told me that my case had been flagged for review after a social worker saw my message about updated contacts and a note about worsening symptoms, and that she had pulled my file at dawn, run it through the community care guidelines, and determined that my out-of-pocket could be reduced significantly with the remainder moved into a zero-interest plan that respected both math and reality, and I felt something unclench in my jaw because this, finally, was a human being making a decision that aligned with the facts in front of her rather than the version of events that makes everyone comfortable. I thanked her in a way that probably sounded intense, and before I hung up I asked if the hospital ever accepted donations to the patient fund in honor of someone, and she said yes, often. And without a tremor, I made a small monthly pledge in my parents' first names, not because I wanted to be cute, but because I wanted every automated receipt to land in my inbox as a quiet record that the sentence about investing in what matters had finally been put to work where it should have been placed from the start. And if you think that is petty, then perhaps you have never needed to build yourself a staircase out of small dignities just to get back to level ground. Next I answered the magazine editor, and I kept my voice as even as a news anchor on a slow day while I explained that I was not chasing a takedown or a spectacle, that I simply wanted the record to reflect that quotes about family investment can hit like a slap when they are timed against a very different choice made in the same month, and she surprised me by saying she understood more than I might think, that she would not publish names because that turns a conversation into a pile-on, but that their website was preparing a short piece for their relationships section about what it means to invest in what matters when family members have conflicting needs, and would I be willing to provide the generic paperwork and redact what I wanted. Because a real example without identifiers can move a conversation out of cliches and into adult decisions, and I said yes on the condition that she include a short resource box about hospital assistance programs and medical proxies, which is how I turned a brag into a public service without once typing an insult, and I hung up feeling the kind of clean that sleep never quite gives. I saved my father for last, not because I wanted to savor anything but because I knew that whatever I did next would cement the new terms forever. And the friend from his committee solved the timing for me by sending a courteous email that read like a legal memo, explaining that the post had circulated and that while nobody was naming names, the quote was recognizable, and that if my dad wanted to avoid an awkward agenda item, he might consider making a statement to the group about prioritizing family health over events when hard choices arise. And there it was, the consequence he had always dodged. Not a mob, not a scandal, just a room of peers asking him to align his public sentences with private behavior. And I forwarded that note to my parents with a single paragraph that took me a decade to learn how to write, which said that if they wanted access to me again, they would have to begin with a written acknowledgement of the choice they made. Not dressed up as timing or markets or plans already in motion, but as a choice, and that after that acknowledgement they could send a letter to the same committee clarifying their values, and that only when both were done would I consider a short call, not to rehash the past, but to outline boundaries for the future. They called instead of writing, and I let the calls ring out because I am done negotiating my needs against other people's panic. And then the emails arrived. My mom with paragraphs of trembling justifications tucked between declarations of love. My dad with a lean note about how the public nature of my post had put him in a difficult position, and how he wished I had given him a chance to fix things quietly. And I wrote back to both with a single line that said the same thing in two slightly different ways, which was that I do not accept retroactive gestures offered to manage optics, and that truth in writing is the only currency I will accept. And then I paused and did the thing that turned this entire story from a storm into a verdict. I attached their earlier text declining any support, I attached the estimate, and I attached a screenshot of my small monthly donation to the hospital fund in their names with the subject line, "Investing in what matters," and I hit send knowing I had just placed a mirror in their hands that would not crack no matter how they shook it. If you are waiting for a dramatic apology, the kind that makes music swell in movies, you are going to be disappointed, because what I got instead, hours later, was an email from my father that was shorter than any message he has ever sent me, admitting that they had made a choice that privileged an event over my health, acknowledging that the words he spoke at a microphone sounded different when set next to a bill with my name on it, and offering to wire an amount that would clear what remained as a gesture of repair. And I wrote back with the calm of someone who has nothing left to prove that I would not be accepting money wired under the heat of embarrassment, that my plan with the hospital was in place, that any contribution they wanted to make could go to the same fund I had already chosen, and that if they sent me a receipt in the next week, I would consider a short call in which we would discuss how not to repeat any of this ever again. The last piece slid into place without fanfare because the magazine ran its small article with anonymized documents and a tidy resource box, and the committee circulated a brief note about aligning values with private decisions. And I went in for surgery with my friend Dana waiting in the lobby, my neighbor Patrice checking on my apartment, and my phone on Do Not Disturb with a single folder of documents that told the story straight if anyone ever tried to twist it again. And when I woke up, groggy and aching but on the other side of the hill, there was a single receipt in my inbox confirming a donation to the patient fund in my parents' names and no commentary attached, and I smiled in a way that felt new, because the ending was not cinematic. But it was mine, and it was exact, and while the calls still come sometimes with their confusion and their guilt and their need to be forgiven on a timetable that suits them, I answer only when I want to, under terms I wrote, and every time I let a ring go silent, I remember that I did not burn the house down. I just turned on the lights and walked out with the deed to my self-respect in my pocket, which is not polite and not traditional, but it is, finally, what I call winning.